the best approach that I've learned is look at the whole value chain and how much value can be created by your technology. Look at all the players who have to be active and engaged in that value chain and decide how much they're going to need to earn to be motivated and how much risk they're going to have to take and how much investment they're going to have to make. And if you can't see a benefit for everyone in that value chain to participate, then you've got a problem you need to solve. You either need to convince people to give something up to that entity, or you have to create more value as a whole, right? So that there's more to be shared. So it's not just about selling to the interface you have. It's actually looking at the entire value chain that you need to enable and make sure it spells success for everyone in some way.
Welcome to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast. Too many advanced science and engineering companies fail to deliver their innovations from the lab to the market. We are on a mission to change that. My name is Chris Reichhelm, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deep Tech Leaders. Each week, we speak with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, and policymakers about what it takes to succeed on the lab to market journey. Join us. If you're a deep tech entrepreneur wondering how you're going to commercialize your business, you need to listen to today's podcast. If you've got an embedded technology platform and you're wondering how you're going to commercialize that, you need to listen to today's podcast. And if you've got a licensing business model, then you really need to listen to today's podcast. I am so fortunate to be joined by Tony Cochrane. Tony is the Chief Commercial Officer of Ceres Power PLC. Ceres Power is a UK headquartered fuel cell technology business. Its business model is licensing and services. And there are fewer businesses out there than fuel cell technology businesses that are more difficult to build, scale, and commercialize. So for those platform technology companies out there, you really need to pay attention. I am so interested to talk to Tony and find out about his lab to market journey, what they had to learn and get their head around, the level of preparation that was required in order for them to win their first slate of customers. So without further ado, let's get into it. Tony Cochrane, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Let's get right into it. Your background is going to be super interesting to so many of our listeners, in particular those who are interested in taking their company from zero in revenue. And let's be very clear, most of these deep tech, advanced science and engineering companies that are out there have zero revenues, and taking them to where you've taken Ceres, which today is at around the 22 million pound mark. And so that journey of commercialization, where it's not just getting that first industrial partner or the first customer, but getting many, building a business model on the back of it, and building sustainable, continuous revenues is super interesting. So that's what I want to get into with you today. Start me off. When you joined, where was the company in terms of their development?
Yeah, so I joined the company 9 years ago now. And at that time, they had gone through a pretty major misstep in commercialization prior to me joining. And the main reason for that was twofold. The tech wasn't quite ready, which is very dangerous to a company. And the business model was about the hardest business model you could choose to introduce technology into. And what I mean by that is Ceres, before I joined, was a company that was going to introduce solid oxide fuel cells, which in of itself sounds complicated. And they were going to try and sell it as a boiler replacement to individual homes in the UK. Now, if you think about that for a minute, if you're going door to door to people who don't even know what solid oxide means and telling them to invest a premium relative to what they could replace their boiler for for totally new technology and trust us, this is going to work, which it didn't. That caused a major problem for Ceres, including the need for a rescue financing package, which happened about 2 years before, or a year and a half before I joined. And so that was my starting point, a major reset to the company, new investors, and a realization that the technology, which had matured since I joined to a point of readiness, needed a new business model as well in order to be introduced into the market. So that was my starting point at Ceres, and it was a really interesting challenge at that time. Yeah,
I bet. Had that business model been defined at the point you joined?
it had. So the concept of it had been defined. So the decision prior to me joining was that to introduce a capital intensive product line for a technology that had multiple uses rather than a single product use warranted a licensing business model, which I agreed with. And that's part of the reason I joined Ceres, is because I agreed with the business model. I understood what licensing meant, and I had very good insight into assessing the technology itself at that time, given I was in that industry for 17 years prior to joining the company.
Yeah, that's right. And you had come from Ballard, haven't you?
Yes, correct. So it was also a fuel cell company, also very similar sort of chemical reactions and approaches. And so I had unique insight into what I thought of the technology, how ready I thought it was. Obviously, I was privy to some confidential disclosures at that time about what the technology really was. And I was very confident that given what I saw and the business model that was chosen, I could add value in my commercial role.
Yeah. In terms of technology readiness, where was it at the point when you joined?
So,
if you had in terms of a rating, for example.
Yeah, so the technology was probably at, if people are used to TRL levels and so on, it had reached probably a TRL 6 to 7. But the good news for Ceres when I joined is the manufacturing readiness was about equivalent. And that's really important, is that Ceres had coupled the manufacturing and the design together very early on. And in fact, all of the samples that were being tested early on and all of the R&D samples that have been tested since have all been produced on the manufacturing equipment that's intended for commercialization. And what that does is it gives you both of the maturity indicators at the same time, which is very, very powerful for a technology company.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, there are a few companies that manage to scale both the technology and the manufacturing readiness levels concurrently.
Yes, it is rare, and in the industry I'm in, it's a necessity because the process technology contains a lot of the trade secrets related to the technology. So how you make it is fundamental to the performance of the technology, but also it's fundamental to the confidentiality, which under a license is an imperative. So when you think about a licensing model, a license to only patents are already in the public domain. So people can read those. They don't need to talk to you about what your patents say. But if you have trade secrets and know-how that you can layer onto your patents, that significantly increases the value of your license, which was fundamentally important to our business model at that time.
But then is that know-how delivered via a services component to the offering?
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about how the business model was commercialized. So when I joined, as I said, the concept of a licensing business model was agreed. The board believed that was the right approach. I was brought in because I had some experience in licensing business models, and I knew what that meant. And what I decided to do with my team at the time was to set a mold. And it's really important for technology companies when they start to not think about the contract they have ahead of them as their first adopter, but think about how it scales before you sign your first agreement. And what I mean by that is that companies that are too accommodating of their first and very important partner sometimes make mistakes that interfere with future contracts with partner 2, 3, and 4. So I was quite deliberate at the time to make sure that whatever we put in place commercially was future-proof to the second, third, fourth licensee, so that the first contract wouldn't interfere with scaling. And the kinds of things that interfere with scaling are exclusivity rights, preferred terms, most favored nation, all the things that your first partner will try and demand of you can sometimes erode your ability to scale and to be commercially successful with your second, third, and fourth partner. And anyone who's starting any journey on a business model needs to really think about how robust it is to that scaling of the commercial terms themselves. And so I institutionalized a licensing model that included upfront technology transfer fees, which are meaningful to the company, that pays the bills today. I introduced engineering services, which delivered the technology through essentially consulting expertise that our employees have. Then obviously the long-term prize, the one that really adds value to the company, are the royalties themselves. And all three of those elements were built on the first contract we ever signed. So we could continue to use that mold and that approach with subsequent licensees and partners.
How easy was it to get that first contract away?
It was hard. And the reason it was hard is because you have to fight for the things that you absolutely need long term with a partner who knows they have a lot of clout over you at a time where the company desperately needs revenues. And it's difficult. So the support you need, and obviously I had that support from the board and CEO, you need to be able to walk away. And we did walk away from some of our first deals. But if you believe in the strength of your technology and your value proposition, those partners will come back. And they usually do because they really value what you have to offer. And that's really important to know that you're valued enough that people will test your willingness to walk away. And if you do, they'll come back to you and find a suitable compromise, which we were able to do.
Now, they often come back provided the problem for them is real enough. And there's a recognition that you've got a solution to that problem, a workable solution to that problem that can be implemented, that's going to work. They've got a lot of confidence there. At the time of you joining and running through this first contract with your first customer, was that recognized by them that they had this kind of problem for which this solution was going to work? Or were they still unsure?
Yeah, so the good news for us is that, and I'd recommend testing how interested people are very early in any relationship that involves a partnership. But our early partners had already tried to do what we do, which was very powerful. So if someone has tried to do what you do and realized it's hard and can't do it themselves, but believe in the value in the business case, you're in a very strong position because they know they need you to succeed and they really want to succeed. But that has to be tested quite early. So the strength of the business case needs to be strong enough. And the appreciation for the technology ingredients that you enable in that business case needs to be understood and valued. Otherwise, it's very difficult to introduce new technology through a partnership. The other thing that is quite important is it's not only about selling the business case to your partner, but it depends a little bit about how deep the value chain is. Because that partner needs to be able to either sell direct to a consumer, or end user, which is good. Then you only have one sales process. But if your partner is embedded deep in the value chain, there's actually a cascading selling process where the value of the technology needs to flow through the entire channel. And that's a much more difficult sales process, because sometimes you have to convince their customers that your technology is truly differentiated and adds value to that entity's business case as well. And you have to work on the principle of what I call net value add to everyone in the value chain. And everyone has to play a role. Everyone's going to take some risk. And everyone needs to extract their portion of value to reward them for that risk. And so it can increase the complexity of the sale quite a bit, depending on how deep in the value chain your technology is embedded into.
How long did it take you to win that first contract?
So it was about an 8-month process with about as I said, about a 1-month pause for people to rethink their interests. And obviously that was a nervous month, as you can imagine. But it was the right thing to do. And we ended up with a very, very strong relationship. We believed very much that the partnership was important as well. So we wanted to make sure that all the pieces were future-proofed, not only for the partnership that we were staring at, but as I said, future-proof for the business model itself. And it's, again, when you're too impatient about getting it done right, you can sometimes sign up to terms that you shouldn't reasonably have agreed to. And that obviously is a challenge for a startup company. It's a challenge because you need the revenue, you need the commercial traction. Everyone who's invested is usually very impatient about the result, but you need to hold your nerve and get the right contract in place and set the company on the right trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point you make, where we've seen this a lot, especially, I think this is true, especially of inexperienced founders who may be doing this for the first time, building their first company in one of these advanced science or engineering disciplines, and trying to commercialize it for the first time, where they just don't have that. They don't have that experience, and what's possible commercially isn't fully known yet by the board or the leadership team, and so invariably someone blinks. And I think when you've got that, then, as you say, then you can run into those problems, and you can wind up making compromises, which are ultimately going to come back and could challenge you later on.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I would also say is that every tech company I know of thinks their technology is best in class and tell their investors there's some sort of hockey stick curve of growth. Now, you've seen millions of them, because that's what people want to hear. You got best technology and there's explosive growth. Now, that doesn't mean that's not true, but I think that the most responsible thing for a commercial representative to do is to be quite strong in the test of whether both those assumptions are true. And because ultimately the commercial people in the company have to represent the technology to the customers, and the customers are going to ask the difficult questions. And I think it's the responsibility of the commercial organization to ask those difficult questions of the internal teams stating them, so that if they're not quite true, that we need to test that and make it better in some way. And if it is true, then you have to really be able to package that well and understand it well, so it can be properly represented through the customer and value chain. And similarly, on the growth assumptions, it's very easy for a technology lens to assume commercialization challenges as easily overcome. And they're not, right? If a company's filled with engineering and science lenses, they think once you solve the technology, you're done.
Yeah.
And commercializing technology takes a lot of persuasion, it takes, channel management, it takes partnership acquisition. You got to think, if you're a product company, you got to think about the service model, the warranty model. You got to think about the assurances you have to give contractually to the early adopters and ultimately the broad adoption cycle. And all of those have a huge interaction with the rate of growth that you can enable. So it's not just about solving the technology problem, it's about solving the whole problem for the market.
It's about building a solution, because all of those other things you've just mentioned there are all elements of a solution, all features of a solution ultimately. When
Exactly.
you joined, was there a solution already? Or was it still just a TRL 6 or 7 technology that was becoming more stable with a business model that was workable?
Yeah, so the solution was not yet fully defined. And the reason I joined and believed that the technology was commercially ready was because in Ceres' particular case, the product development cycle that embeds the technology was also quite long, which means there was time to solve some of the final technical challenges, and there was time to build the solution through the value chain while our partners were developing the product around the technology, which was years, not months. So it depends a little bit on the product and the business model. In a licensing business model, we would obviously ask the partner to build the factory. The partner would build the product, and our role was to enable the license to be practiced so that the partner can succeed with not only the product but also the manufacturing of the product. That was our role, which means you could embark on that journey quite early, and it was a true collaboration over years to get to that end result. If you're a software company, I imagine those cycles are much, much shorter. The good news, though, is that you can, with software updates, the ability to remedy any shortfall is better. Whereas in a brick and mortar product business, you've got to get it right the first time. The product has to work.
Yeah.
The factory has to be built. There's not a lot of room for mistakes. And so it really does depend on what your product is and what market you're going after in terms of how conservative it is and how risk averse it is.
Yeah. How many meetings did you have before you signed that first contract? Not just with that client, but you join, you agree with the business model, you start going out. Obviously, they're looking for revenue from you. How many meetings do you have to have out there, roughly, before you're able to sign that first contract?
Yeah, look, over the course of 8 months of negotiation, I joke that some of my partners spend more time with me than I do with my family, because you have to. The selling of technology into a new product in a new business, which is what we do, involves assessing the technology. No one just believes PowerPoint. You have to sometimes do some testing, send some samples, confirm that they're testing it in the right way. And that's seen as a bit of a waste of time, but unfortunately, it's a necessary ingredient to the belief system that you have to enable. Then there's the testing of the business model. So it's all about risk mitigation. So the first is, how do you minimize the technology risk in the eyes of the end user? Then there's the market risk question. Is there a market risk that you reasonably need to digest? And working on the business case itself can sometimes be part of that collaboration. And then there's the execution plan, the implementation risk. So how do you convince everyone that they can execute against the embedding of the technology into the product? And then they're ready to sign the contract, and then you're negotiating the contractual terms. And so if you can imagine, all of those ingredients have to be part of a collaboration prior to signing. You get quite intimate with your partner before they actually sign on the dotted line. And in large contract selling, which at least in our business model, that's what you do. It's quite a heavy business development investment of time.
Yeah.
I mean,
What
I
are
wouldn't quantify the hours, Chris. I would say it's at least weekly meetings of twice a week, 2 hours. You
yeah,
have to expect that's quite a regular practice with each partner that you're courting.
yeah. And you, I'm assuming we're taking this up and down the value chain as well.
Yeah, in some cases, you've got to bring, as I said, their customers. If it's a deep value chain,
Sure.
you've got to bring some of their stakeholders along as part of the journey. Now, some of the relationships are confidential until they're signed, so there are some sort of disclosure barriers that prevent too much of that happening. There's, when people are building a product, they need to know that the supply chain can support their growth. So there's sometimes suppliers that you have to bring into the foray to help everyone understand what the supply chain risk is involved with
Mm,
scaling. And
mm.
so you're building a business together. And
Yeah.
my approach is always that the best thing to do is to eliminate your company boundaries and look at the business that surrounds both companies. And if you can create good margins and good values for both entities, then all you have to do is figure out how to share that value in an equitable manner. If eliminating the company boundaries doesn't provide enough value, then there's not a deal to be done because there's not enough to share.
Mm. So it's about looking beyond just this one contract with one partner. You've got to see the entire impact across the value chain and understand the distribution of value along that chain. And so in a way that
Exactly.
acts as,
Everyone.
if I'm understanding you correctly, and then you've got to make sure there's enough value to be distributed equitably along that chain. And if there isn't, then maybe you've got the wrong solution or you need to go back and you need to refine whatever it is you're working on.
Yeah, look, everyone in the value chain will only do it if they make money. And understanding who is essential to get to that value chain for your technology to reach the market is really important, because if there's any piece of that value chain where there's no money to be made, it's going to be a missing link in the chain. And so how do you then motivate that link in the chain to be active and interested in the business? And the only way you do that is you have to share some of that value with that link. And so the best approach that I've learned is look at the whole value chain and how much value can be created by your technology. Look at all the players who have to be active and engaged in that value chain and decide how much they're going to need to earn to be motivated and how much risk they're going to have to take and how much investment they're going to have to make. And if you can't see a benefit for everyone in that value chain to participate, then you've got a problem you need to solve. You either need to convince people to give something up to that entity, or you have to create more value as a whole, right? So that there's more to be shared. So it's not just about selling to the interface you have. It's actually looking at the entire value chain that you need to enable and make sure it spells success for everyone in some way.
Yeah. I think that's a golden piece of insight, Tony, that I think a lot miss. Maybe it's just me, but I think that most people, when they're thinking of value propositions, are thinking about a value proposition that extends between one and one, between two people or between two parties. They're not considering the broader impact across an entire value chain. Um, when you think about the time you joined, you were commercial person number one at Ceres. Was that right?
Uh, yeah, there was a regional representative doing some work, but in terms of the true build of the commercial organization, I was
Yeah.
really the first of a new era of commercialization at that time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Can you walk us through a little bit the development and evolution of the commercial group, and and also expand on your views on how and when you build teams and the kinds of skills and experience and talents you're going to need in a business like this?
Yeah. So the trick is to make sure that you manage the near term expectations well of what do you want to achieve near term, what does the business need near term, and again, how do you scale so that the longer term growth aspirations can also be fulfilled through some investment today. And so I knew already that the sales process for large contracts involving licensing are not, short-term transactions that you just hire 20 or 50 salespeople and put them to work on. It doesn't work that way in the kind of business that I was entering. And I knew that it was a partnership relationship type sale that required some intimate knowledge of the technology and how it could be used, as well as some of the commercial acumen that it takes to sign the contract that packages that result. And so what we did is we were very targeted about which partners met the kind of criteria of a first licensee, because that couldn't go wrong. If you're a technology company and your first customer fails, it doesn't matter if it's their fault. The whole technology gets tarnished with a brand of failure, and you can't sell another contract thereafter. So we were quite deliberate about not trying to go with a broad business development approach, but instead we targeted 2 regions which we felt were strategic, which had the right ingredients for early adoption and had the kind of partners that we thought would be the best custodians of our brand in terms of how they would use the technology and how they would be successful. So we went to Japan and Europe. And one of our first partners was Bosch. That's no secret. That's public domain. Mm-hmm. Why do you pick Bosch? Well, Bosch is got the balance sheet. They've got the manufacturing pedigree. They've got channels to multiple markets. They've got material scientists who needed to be conversant in our ceramics-based technology. So they had such strategic ingredients as the right partner for that first commercialization license that we felt we would focus on that first. And what that did was it sold the next wave of licensees. So, once you've sold the technology to someone who's highly credible in the industry, then the fact that they've bought it is already part of your sales process. It's part of how you reach what I call external endorsement of your technology. And so then we expanded into Korea, which was also a strategic market for us, signed a relationship with Doosan, signed a relationship with Weichai in China, who actually came to us with a strategic interest. And then we've built the business since. And what we tried to do is focus on a region that was strategic, build a representation in that region to look at the primary candidates in that market, and then qualify a few candidates and ultimately work through the new licensee in each region. And our goal, and it's still our goal, to put a strategic partner in each and every region and in each and every market that deserves an access for our technology. We're not done yet. There's still work to do, but it's a very much a win and build approach rather than hire 50 salespeople and throw them out into the world and hope you reel in some partners. I think you could do that if you had a huge amount of sales budget. Most startup companies don't. We didn't. So we had to adopt you build it, you grow, you build it further, you grow further. And now we have 25, 30 people in the commercial organization. We have regional representation, across the globe. And what we've done is we haven't only hired our own employees, we've also used agencies in some areas to minimize the employee burden on the company. And they can be quite effective depending on the type of business you're in. You don't necessarily have to hire everyone. You can do some business development through agencies and other representation if it makes sense to your business model.
In Asia, that's quite popular.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
There's also some taxation reasons to do that. You consider things like permanent establishments, and you sometimes want to avoid those in certain countries. The best thing to do is actually to use agencies to avoid some of those problems.
Yes. Securing Bosch as a first customer is the dream for so many similar types of businesses. If you were to put yourself in their shoes, evaluating you, Tony, and Ceres generally, what was it about you guys that ultimately made them sign? What did they see from Ceres? What did they get that made them say, "Okay, we're going to do this deal with these guys"?
Yeah, look, without revealing some of the commercial circumstances of those decisions, as I said earlier, they already had a practice in the same technology domain as us, so solid oxide. They had a team that was doing some of their own work. They knew how hard it was. They already have products that use similar manufacturing processes to us. And so they understood not only what we're doing, but why we're doing it well, even compared to some of their own practices, which have hundreds of millions of euros of revenue attached to them. I think they saw an organization that adopted good practices in technology development, but also retained its nimbleness. So in other words, you can't be just a lab company and be seen as a bit of a bunch of cowboys. You have to actually be able to show that you have a mature approach to maturing the technology, that there's business processes behind that, which aren't very expensive to invest in, but they need to be credible in the eyes of a big company.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, just,
what kinds of things?
The way you release your drawings. So, they took a lot at our drawing packages and how we release drawings. They took a look at our testing protocols. Did we have, a statistical approach to our testing, or was it just we built a sample, we didn't really know what it was, and we got a good result, but we can't explain it. I mean, sometimes companies they get lucky, but they can't explain why they got lucky, and that's too much risk for an adopter. I think if a company can show that they knew why the technology works or why the technology works now, and that they considered some of the failures that resulted in that success and learned from them and institutionalized the practices of proper failure analysis, proper qualification and verification of your results, proper documentation of some of the results, then you minimize the risk, right? And it's all about minimizing technology risk so that people believe that they can count on your technology for a business case. And if you can institutionalize those practices and make them visible, then you can give confidence. And I think Bosch saw that in us, that we had put in good practices, good test infrastructure, good validation practices, good engineering documentation, and they could read all that and see all that and go, okay, this is real. And that's really important.
That built trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes sharing what you learned in your failures is actually quite important as well. It's not just about sharing success. It's about being able to share that we tried some of these paths and they don't work, and here's why. And this is why our technology is unique, because we've solved some of these problems.
So there's a level of professionalism that is required operationally and technologically in terms of the way things are developed and the way the technology, the way data is captured, the way testing is handled. And ultimately, I'm guessing too, in the way that the whole engagement is approached, which is led by commercial. The and in making that journey, one thing we see companies struggle with is understanding when to wrap in or fold in some of those practices that will take you down a more rigorous line, and some may argue may stifle a little bit, but are so important in order to build that level of credibility. Do you have a view on when you introduce those?
I think it costs you very little to introduce those quite early. A lot of people think that's documentation burden. I don't believe that's the case. I think that you can implement those practices and that culture very early in a company, and it doesn't slow you down. Some of those practices are actually enabling of better development, more credible development. Because the worst thing you can do is achieve a successful result and not understand why, or achieve a successful result and not be able to replicate it. And not only replicate it within your company, but when someone says, I don't believe your PowerPoint, I would like to replicate this within my company. If you can't share all the documentation on how you achieved that result, including the testing you did, and they fail to reproduce that result, they're not going to believe your technology. And so many big companies demand that they should be able to replicate your result if you know what you're doing. And so I would recommend that those practices be institutionalized very early in a way that doesn't slow a company down. And that's the magic to it, is don't go so big on process that it slows the innovation, but make sure that the underpinning of good practices is built into the organization very early on.
Yeah. It's going to help business development enormously,
Yeah.
amongst other things. The commercial role itself, what are the skills and experience you think are needed in order to be able to handle the job that you've performed?
Yeah, look, I think because the subject matter here is deep tech, right? It's technology
Yeah.
companies. I think the commercial role in in the companies that I know of that are involved in embedding deep technology into the value chain. First of all, the commercial role really needs to understand the benefit of the technology in the eyes of the market, not in the eyes of the company that's trying to sell it, but how does the end user interact with the technology in a way that matters to them. And so, I mean, I have an engineering background. I ruined my engineering by taking an MBA, and I'm now spending part of my time pretending to be a lawyer with contracting. So those are the ingredients I bring to the table. But I rely very heavily on my what I call technical commercial interface. That I use my technical background to understand the technology, but with the market lens that I feel is going to matter to the end user. And so what features are going to be experienced? So there's many products where the technology isn't actually known by the end user. So you buy a new phone and Apple might market a chip with a code name to you, and that means absolutely nothing in reality. What matters more is probably the quality of the camera or something like that. So the people who are developing the chips think that it's really, really important that people know how many, I don't know, graphics processors are on it and all that. It's really important to the technology people within the company, but it's not experienced by the end user. And so I think the commercial role in a technology company really needs to help the organization understand what really matters in the eyes of the end user and how that translates back through the value chain to the commercial interface that you're trying to broker. And that skill set of filtering out the noise, and some of it is noise, to distill it to the sort of essence of value is probably the most important skill any commercial person can bring to a technology company.
What is your audience? If you look at the evolution of the contracts you've put together, the development of them, your audience as you're developing this, tell me a little bit about their backgrounds in these organizations. Is it starting with R&D and then moving through different
Yeah.
layers of the organization, different areas?
Yeah, it changes over the course of the selling process. Look, the early audience is someone who believes there's a business, and a technology advisor who believes that the technology is enabling in some way. So you normally start in an embedded technology sales process. You have to make sure there's money behind the question. So there's the business owner who thinks they're going to build a business or a better business because of your technology. And there's usually someone in a technology advisory role who needs to validate that what your technology does is indeed true and differentiated. And so the relationships start there. And then, unfortunately, they do go into a prove your technology works phase. So if the business case is sound and the assumptions about the technology result in a positive business case outcome, the next question is, can we believe you? And so you end up in a technology interface for a period until the technology advisor says, yes, the technology is better than our own or someone else's, and it's differentiated in the way that's proclaimed. Once you get through that gate, then you'll get back into the business and commercial forum, which says, how are we going to share the value that each party deserves because we can enable this business outcome for you? So then it goes very much back to a commercial terms relationship. Usually people like to use heads of terms or, some summary of the commercial terms. And then once that's agreed, the last step is obviously the legal work. And then you're into teams of lawyers digesting fairly nuanced contractual language. And it's really important that before you start that process, that the commercial terms are clear, understood, and agreed, because otherwise you can waste a lot of time decoding that through legal language, which takes a lot more time and energy if you haven't done it right at the commercial level.
How much time does that legal process add on to the entire thing?
Well, in our business model, because it's a licensing contract that's quite complex, months. But I'm not suggesting that every tech company would need to digest that kind of contractual complexity. It really depends on what you're trying to put into that contract. We have licensing terms, long-term royalties, performance obligations in the implementation phase. So our contracts tend to be very complex and require that kind of effort. But I imagine that there's many businesses that could do it in a lot less time.
But you've got this engineering background and appreciation, which you can bring to discussions, which are important in the early stage, I suppose, in order to set out the case. And I'm guessing that during that phase, it's really important that you really want to be careful with the claims you're making around the technology, because in all of this, you're trying to establish credibility.
Yeah.
So you have to really have a sense of what is possible with the platform you've got at that moment in time, so that as much as possible, again, the results they create with your in their sampling process of your technology are going to broadly replicate what you've created before, hopefully. So again, that trust is there. But it's hard to do that, I would think, without being able to communicate well enough with that audience. And so some engineering or a technology affiliation or background, some comfort level with that is going to be important. as part of the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, at least our transactions are not just a commercial supply transaction. They are a 25-year partnership, not only for the generation of technology that's available today, but also to build the belief system that our technology in future iterations will continue to be competitive long term. So we're not just selling a trust in what we say today, we're selling a trust in the capability of the company itself to iterate on the technology and advance the technology long term so that the partnership remains healthy long term. So it's, again, it depends on your business model. It depends on the commercial transactions that you're trying to broker. But in our case, in the licensing business model, we not only have to sell the technology, but as I said, it's a new market. So we've got to understand the market risk that we're asking our partners to digest and help them mitigate some of that through, agreements, for example, to learn from the market and embed those requirements in our next generation designs. So we have to make some commitments around, if we learn something together about what makes you even more successful, we will take that on and we'll build it into R&D processes so that you get a better version of the design in 3 years. We also build detailed implementation plans to help people build factories. So again, the knowledge of what does it take to build a factory? What capabilities does our partner have? How do we complement those? Without a good understanding of each party's strengths and how they can be combined, you don't end up building that confidence and trust and mitigating the risks. And again, it's all about getting people comfortable to take the step to adopt the technology and invest in its commercialization. And risk is a big portion. Mitigating risk is a big portion of the sales process.
Yeah. It's a big thing that keeps coming up on this podcast and people we talk to, especially those from corporates. But these skills, that technical appreciation, obviously the commercial piece, the strategic relationship development, moving that process along, and the legal piece together, particularly in this model. Licensing, yes, you absolutely have to have an appreciation for the legals as well. At some point, and in the early days when you're establishing those early beachhead customers and partners, I can understand how you need that and how you need that blend that we've just discussed. At some point, at what point do you think you're able to relax that, if at any point, and maybe start to look towards more sales-oriented hires? People that may not have those full backgrounds, but because you've got such a track record, you may have standard terms, you've got the confidence to wheel out standard terms, you've got precedent, et cetera.
Yeah, look, I think every technology company should look at their commercial trajectory and think about, who are the early adopters and how do you motivate them to take the appropriate risk, because there are still some unknowns, and how do you make sure they're successful, because your early adopters have to be successful. I can't emphasize that enough. You can't afford to let an early adopter down in any scalable business model, because you totally lose confidence in the market when you do. So you have to pick your early adopters carefully. You have to invest heavily in their success. And there are still, in that relationship, some unknowns that require that confidence building, that more nuanced approach. But you're right, Chris. I think once you've done it a few times and the market validation, not the technology validation, but the market validation proof points are all there, then the technology starts speaking for itself in some respects. And then you get the later adopters who aren't really taking as much risk. They don't need as much persuasion about the risk mitigation. And you get into more standardized, repeatable sales era. Now, Ceres isn't there yet. We're still, in the adoption phase and primarily early adopters. But I imagine that some years from now, once some of the first factories are all producing volume successfully, rewarding those early adopters, there's a wave of follow-on customers who don't have anywhere near the same barrier to entry that you have to digest early on. And then you probably don't need the sales sophistication that we're applying today.
Yeah. Ceres was your first startup, I think.
Yeah, certainly in the capacity I'm in now. Yes.
Yeah. If you look back, what have been the biggest lessons for you?
Yeah, look, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is to really focus on the entire business risk reward equation that you're asking your customers to believe you about. And, that sounds obvious, but I think that when you start in a commercial role, and I was somewhat guilty of that, is you look at the commercial interface you have in front of you and you go, all right, if I can sell this contract, I'm done. And, it's in the public domain that some of the things that we hoped about the speed at which, the factories would come online and the trajectory of the relationship have been longer than we thought. And I take huge responsibility for that, right? I really want the business to succeed, not just the commercial contract terms to be upheld. And so there's been quite openly quite a lot of adjustments to the contract that was signed originally that were reasonable for us to make, given what we learned along the way. And so, and probably could have been avoided or better managed had there been a stronger emphasis on what does this entire business look like? And how do we make sure that we think about all the elements, not only the commercial interface between our two companies, but what is the supply chain elements going to do to add or mitigate risk? What are some of the channel partnerships that need to exist? How might the market evolve? These are time horizons that could result in the market shifting on you, and is everything robust to some of those shifts? And it's a bit of a crystal ball, and I'm not saying there's a science to it, but you have to try. I think you really do have to try early on to think about all the things that could go wrong and make sure that what you put in place is robust.
And you've got to get alignment.
Absolutely.
So whatever you come up with, also, that view needs to be shared.
Yeah.
By
it's a partnership.
Your customer, your partners, and your other value chain participants as well.
Yeah.
Tony, this has been a wonderful, wonderful dive into commercialization. I can't thank you enough for joining me.
No, thank you. It's fun to talk about these things, and not everything I say is right, but hopefully I've learned a few things along the way.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Deep Tech Leaders. This podcast has been produced by Bauhaus. You can find out more about us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.